She called me poor, not behind my back, right to my face over dinner while my own son sat there in silence. Amanda, my daughter-in-law, laughed as she compared my old car and outdated clothes to her sleek career and luxury condo. "Don't take it personally, Mom," she said. "You just wouldn't understand how wealth works today." I remember stirring my tea, slowly watching the steam rise. Then I asked her quietly, "What makes you rich, Amanda?" She smiled, ready to brag, and she did. Her car, her job, her apartment, her success. Every word, every boast, another spark on the fire she didn't know she'd lit. Because that night, she mocked the wrong woman. The woman who built empires, then chose silence over vanity. The woman who owned everything she thought was hers. By the time she finished talking, I had already made my decision. She'd learn what old-fashioned power really looked like. Stay with me, because when she finally saw my property list, her smile vanished. Her voice cracked and she begged for forgiveness. And that was just the beginning. My name is Margaret Lane, though most people in town just call me Mrs. Lane. I'm 72 years old, retired for nearly 2 decades now. Once, a long time ago, I ran a company with my late husband, William. We built something from nothing, sleepless nights, long drives, and meetings that stretched until dawn. When he passed, I walked away from that world. I told everyone I just wanted peace. And I meant it. At least I thought I did. These days, my mornings start before the sun is fully awake. I like the quiet hours, the way the air still smells clean, untouched. I slip on my worn gardening gloves and step out to tend to the roses. They've been with me longer than most people I know, delicate but determined, pushing through the seasons, much like me. I kneel pruning carefully, humming to myself, as the radio hums faintly through the kitchen window. The voice of the announcer floats across the yard, something about a new corporate merger. Stock prices rising, a company I recognize. I smile to myself, though I doubt anyone else would understand why. Old habits die hard, especially the habit of staying informed. Still up early, Mrs. Lane? It's my neighbor Carol walking her dog. She's cheerful as always, her words carrying across the hedge. Quiet takes practice, I call back smiling. She laughs, waves, and moves along, her little terrier barking at the dew. I stand there a moment longer, feeling the warmth of the sun begin to touch my back. Carol thinks I wake early because I'm old, that I have nowhere else to be. In truth, I still wake with the same purpose that used to pull me into boardrooms. Only now my work is quieter. My investments, my properties, my shares. They hum along in the background, growing quietly, like the roots beneath my garden. When I step back inside, the smell of coffee fills the house. I pour myself a cup and settle at the kitchen table. It's an old table oak with a faint crack running along one edge. William carved our initials underneath when we first bought the house. I run my fingers over the grain, remembering his voice. He used to say that wealth wasn't about what you could show, it was about what you could keep. The radio continues faintly as I unfold the morning paper. Corporate mergers, the headline reads. I know that company. I've owned a quiet stake in it for years. Most wouldn't believe it if they knew. That's fine with me. I've never cared for show. Across from me, his photograph sits on the sideboard. William, in his favorite navy suit, smiling just slightly, the way he always did when he knew more than the person across the table. I pick up the frame and whisper, "You'd be proud." The world finally forgot me. For a moment, I just sit there holding his gaze. There's a comfort in being forgotten. People stop expecting things from you. They stop pretending to know who you are. They see the gray hair, the cardigans, the little garden, and they assume you've faded into your own twilight. That's the kind of peace I've lived in for years. I spend the rest of the morning moving through my small rituals, watering plants, checking the mail, balancing a few numbers in my notebook. It's simple work, comforting. There's satisfaction in order in the predictability of things. When the sun climbs higher, I stand by the window sipping my coffee and watch the neighborhood wake. Cars pull out of driveways, children hurry to the bus stop, life unfolding in its ordinary rhythm. No one looks this way. No one wonders what goes on behind the ivy-covered fence. And that's exactly how I like it. Still, sometimes, I can't help but feel a flicker of something restless under all this peace. Perhaps it's habit. Perhaps it's the part of me that used to lead meetings, negotiate contracts, outthink competitors. You don't unlearn that kind of life. You just tuck it away like a well-worn book waiting to be reopened. I glance at the newspaper again. The same company's name stares back at me, bold and familiar. I smile faintly and fold the page. Everything changes, yet somehow the game never does. As the clock ticks toward noon, I think of the dinner tomorrow night. Daniel and Amanda are coming over, my son and his new wife. I've only met her twice. She's young, confident, the kind who never doubts she's right. Daniel says she's modern, as if that's supposed to explain everything. I told him I was looking forward to seeing them. I meant it. I'm curious what kind of woman makes my son so proud. Outside, the breeze rustles the curtains. The roses sway gently, their petals catching the light. It's a beautiful day, calm, predictable, just as I like it. Still, I can't shake the thought that peace, like porcelain, can crack easily if handled carelessly. I take another sip of coffee and whisper to the quiet room. But peace never lasts, not in families. I remember thinking that as I set the table the next afternoon, folding the napkins the way William used to like them. The house was quiet, except for the soft clinking of china and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My son Daniel and his wife were due any minute, and though I'd spent the morning convincing myself I wasn't nervous, my hands betrayed me polishing the same fork twice, straightening what didn't need straightening. It had been months since I'd seen Daniel. He'd moved to the city for work, married quickly, and called rarely. He was always polite on the phone, careful with his words. That's how I knew he was hiding something: distance guilt, or maybe both. I wanted to meet Amanda properly, not just through the filtered smiles of his wedding photos. I wanted to see who had captured my son's admiration so completely. When their car pulled up the driveway, I wiped my hands on my apron and glanced out the window. Daniel stepped out first, taller, thinner than before, wearing the same gentle smile I'd known since he was a boy. Then I saw her, Amanda. She was striking, no doubt about that, tall, poised with the kind of confidence that fills a room before she even speaks. Her clothes were sharp, expensive in that way only people who care about being noticed would choose. She walked ahead of Daniel up the path, her heels clicking against the stone, her eyes sweeping over everything like she was inspecting a property listing. "Mom, meet Amanda," Daniel said as they reached the door. I opened my arms and smiled. "Welcome, Amanda. It's good to finally meet you." She leaned in, air-kissed my cheek, her perfume filling the space between us. "Oh, Mrs. Lane, your home is so retro," she said, her tone sweet, but her smile assessing. Her eyes flicked over the wallpaper, the wooden frames, the antique clock. "It's like a museum." I let the moment linger, still smiling. "Then I must be the antique," I said softly. Daniel chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck, that old nervous habit of his. "Amanda appreciates modern design," he offered quickly, as though to smooth over the sting. Amanda laughed lightly, oblivious. "I just love clean lines and minimalism. You know, open space, neutral tones. This place must be so much work to keep up." I motioned toward the living room. Well, it's lasted longer than most things built these days. As we moved inside, she took her time looking around. Every glance was a quiet judgment. My floral curtains, the framed photographs, the little porcelain figurines on the mantel. I could almost hear the tally in her mind: outdated, unnecessary, irrelevant. She had that restless energy people carry when they think they've already seen everything worth knowing. Daniel tried to fill the silence. Mom, Amanda just got promoted. She's managing her firm's marketing team now. I nodded politely. Congratulations, that's quite an accomplishment. Oh, thank you, Amanda said, settling onto the couch without waiting to be invited. It's all about staying current, you know. I always tell my team adapt or get left behind. The world changes so fast. She looked around again, smiling that polite smile. It's nice you've kept things traditional. I poured tea for everyone, careful and unhurried. Yes, I said. Some things are worth keeping. She accepted the cup, but didn't drink, instead pulling out her phone to check something. Her manicured nails tapped the screen rhythmically, the faint reflection of the phone's light flickering across her face. Daniel looked embarrassed, but said nothing. So Daniel tells me you used to work in business too, Amanda asked after a pause. That must have been a while ago. I met her gaze. A lifetime ago, yes. What kind of business was it? She asked, her tone casual, but her eyes curious measuring. Oh, small things, I replied. A company my husband and I built together. We sold it before we retired. She smiled the kind of smile people give when they think they're indulging you. That's sweet, she said. It must be nice not having to worry about all the modern complexities. Sweet, I repeated, setting my cup down. That's one word for it. Daniel looked from me to her, sensing something beneath the civility, but unsure how to name it. I decided to let it rest. There would be time enough to see what kind of woman Amanda really was. People reveal themselves without realizing it. You just have to give them room. Dinner was pleasant enough. Though most of the conversations circled around Amanda's world, her clients, her favorite restaurants, her upcoming trip to California. Daniel mostly listened, nodding in quiet admiration. I could see why he loved her. She carried herself like someone who always knew where she was going. But she hadn't learned yet that knowing where you're going doesn't mean you know who you are. When they left later that evening, the house felt heavier, not quieter. I stood at the window watching their car disappear down the road, the taillights glowing red against the night. Amanda was beautiful, confident, and successful. But there was something else behind that charm, a sharpness, a belief that youth and money made her untouchable. She wasn't rude, she was condescending. That's worse. I thought about that line all night as I rinsed the dishes and turned off the lights. There's a particular kind of weariness that comes from being talked down to politely. I'd been underestimated before by men in meetings, by rivals who thought my calm meant weakness. But there was something new about it coming from a young woman who would someday inherit everything I built. I went to bed that night unsettled, not angry, just aware. Amanda was charming, yes, but charm, when mixed with pride, becomes its own kind of blindness. The next morning was warm and clear, the air sweet, with the smell of damp soil and honeysuckle. I was in the garden early wearing my wide straw hat, pruning shears in hand. Gardening had always been my favorite kind of meditation. Steady, patient, alive. Daniel had texted the night before to say they'd be stopping by again. Amanda wanted to see the garden in daylight. I smiled when I read that. I had a feeling daylight wasn't what she was really after. When their car pulled up, Amanda stepped out first, wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying her phone like it was an extension of her hand. Daniel followed behind, smiling sheepishly, as though apologizing in advance. "We brought coffee," he said. Amanda walked over to the roses. "Oh my gosh, this is perfect, she said, lifting her phone. The light is amazing here. Smile, Mom. Instagram will love this. I turned toward her, a little startled by the camera aimed in my direction. Is that a scrapbook for strangers? I asked. Amanda blinked, lowering her phone slightly. What? Oh no, it's just for fun. You know, to share with friends. I said, adjusting my hat. So people collect pretend happiness now. She paused, uncertain whether I was joking or judging her. Daniel coughed into his cup to hide a smile. Amanda laughed, though it sounded more like a defense than amusement. You're funny, Mrs. Lane. Just old enough to remember real smiles, I replied, and went back to trimming the stems. For a moment, the only sound was the snip of the shears and the faint hum of bees near the hydrangeas. I could feel her watching me, not out of admiration, but curiosity, the way someone watches a species they've never seen up close. She lifted her phone again, angling for the perfect shot. I noticed how she turned her body slightly, finding her light tilting her chin, every movement practiced. Hold on, she said. You look adorable, like that, all earthy and natural. People online love that kind of authenticity. I'm afraid I don't have much of an audience, I said, unless you count the roses. She laughed again, but this time it was genuine, short and surprised. You're actually kind of witty, you know. I've had a long time to practice conversation, I said. Though I suppose talking to plants doesn't count. Daniel sat on the porch steps, sipping his coffee, watching the exchange with quiet amusement. I wondered what he was thinking, if he saw the same undercurrent I did, the polite dance between two women pretending to like each other while measuring every word. Amanda wandered farther into the garden, stopping by the lilac bush. You could make this place go viral, she said. All it needs is a little polish. Maybe add a few modern touches, string lights, some minimal seating, maybe a water feature. You'd be shocked how fast it could blow up online. Blow up, I repeated, pretending to misunderstand. I'd rather it didn't explode. I'm quite fond of it the way it is. Daniel chuckled. Amanda smiled tightly. I just meant it could get a lot of attention. You know, people love things that feel rustic. I looked around at the flowers, the cracked stone path, the ivy creeping up the fence. Rustic, I said. That's one word for something that's been loved too long to change. She took another photo, crouching slightly, adjusting the angle again. It's all about the right filter, she said. I bent to gather a few cuttings, placing them gently in my basket. Funny, I said. I've found the right light comes naturally if you're patient enough to wait for it. Amanda didn't reply. She was too busy framing her shot, tapping, swiping, adjusting. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, her face glowing blue from the screen, her mouth slightly open in concentration. When she was finished, she let out a satisfied sigh and turned the phone toward me. See, isn't that lovely? The image was beautiful in its way. The colors were brighter, the sunlight softer, the wrinkles smoothed from my face. But it wasn't real. The roses looked too perfect, too polished, as if nature itself had been edited. It's very flattering, I said. Exactly, she said brightly. That's what filters are for, I smiled faintly. I suppose so. She posted it immediately, tapping the screen with a little flourish. There, she said. Now everyone can see how charming you are. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for my shears again and trimmed another rose, letting the petals fall into my basket. The sunlight caught them just right. No filter, no adjustment, just the way they were meant to look. Amanda was still staring at her phone, waiting for the first likes to appear. Her expression softened as the notifications started to roll in. It was a small, satisfied smile, the kind that comes from validation rather than joy. I carried the basket inside and placed the fresh flowers in a vase on the kitchen table. When I glanced out the window, she was still out there, turning, posing, adjusting her hair, the phone always between her and the world. That was the first time I understood her, not the woman she was pretending to be, but the one underneath. She wasn't cruel, not really, just young and desperate to be seen, mistaking attention for affection and filters for truth. As I stood there arranging the flowers, I caught her reflection in the glass, smiling at her own image, perfect and distant. She valued filters more than roots. That thought stayed with me long after Amanda and Daniel drove away that afternoon. The garden looked untouched when they left, but something in the air felt different, as though she'd taken the sunlight with her and left behind a strange kind of emptiness. I watered the roses again, even though they didn't need it more for the motion than the purpose. There's comfort in repetition. It steadies the mind when emotions start to stir. I told myself not to judge her too quickly. Youth wears insecurity like perfume strong enough to cover the truth, but never quite hiding it. The following morning, I went into town for groceries. The cafe on the corner was busy, its outdoor tables filled with chatter and clinking cups. I stopped to glance at the menu in the window when I noticed a familiar shape at the far end of the terrace. Amanda sat alone, her sleek laptop open, beside a half-finished cappuccino. She was dressed as if the day itself were a stage-pressed blouse, perfect hair, and those oversized sunglasses that seemed less for the sun and more for protection. She didn't see me, and I didn't plan to disturb her, but what caught my attention was the woman approaching her table. She was older, her clothes plain, but neat. Her hands slightly trembling as she reached for the back of a chair. "Amanda," the woman said softly, her voice hesitant but hopeful. Amanda looked up, her face changing instantly. Surprise, then discomfort, then the calm mask she always wore. "Oh," she said quietly. "Hi." The woman smiled nervously. "I was hoping I'd run into you. I just wanted to see how you're doing." Amanda glanced around, lowering her voice. "I'm fine, Mom, really. I'm just in the middle of something." Her mother's eyes softened, but there was a tiredness in them, a kind of sorrow that comes from long distance, not measured in miles, but in years. "You don't have to hide who you are," she said gently. Amanda's jaw tightened. She looked at her laptop screen, pretending to type. "I'm not that girl anymore," she whispered. For a moment, her mother stood there as if waiting for some invitation that never came. Then she nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'm glad you're doing well," she said, and walked away slowly, her steps uneven but dignified. Amanda didn't look up again until the woman was gone. Then she removed her sunglasses, staring at her reflection in the black screen of her laptop. I couldn't hear her thoughts, but I could imagine the silence that followed, heavy, like the kind that lingers after a door closes on both sides. I turned away before she noticed me and continued down the street, the scene still echoing in my mind. There was something painfully familiar about it, the need to control how the world sees you, even when it costs you the truth. Later that afternoon, I found myself at the hospital. My neighbor, Mrs. Porter, had been admitted for pneumonia. She was in her late 80s, frail but stubborn, the kind of woman who still insisted on paying her own bills, even when her hands shook too much to write. When I arrived, she was arguing softly with the nurse about the cost of her medication. "I can manage," she was saying, fumbling through her purse. The nurse gave me a helpless look. I stepped closer. "Let me help," I said. "Oh, I couldn't ask you to." "You're not asking," I said gently, placing a few folded bills on the counter. "You'll pay me back by getting better." Her eyes filled with tears. "You've always been too kind, Margaret." I smiled. "Not kind, just practical." I don't like to see good people buried under bad luck. After the paperwork was done, I sat with her for a while. We talked about her late husband, her garden, her cat, ordinary things that filled the gaps of loneliness. When I left, she was asleep, her breathing slow but steady. On the way home, I stopped by the florist for a small bouquet. The girl behind the counter asked if it was for someone special. I told her it was for a friend who needed reminding that she wasn't alone. As I walked back to my car, I thought about the woman at the cafe and the way Amanda couldn't bring herself to look at her. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the flowers in a glass jar beside me. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock. I looked around at everything I'd kept: photographs, furniture, trinkets, and realized I'd built my own form of disguise too. Mine wasn't made of filters or designer clothes. It was built from restraint, from silence, from a life carefully edited to look ordinary. I told myself I'd hidden my wealth for noble reasons, to live simply, to protect my privacy, to raise my son without arrogance. But watching Amanda that morning, I saw how pride could twist in any direction. She was hiding her poverty, terrified someone might see where she came from. I was hiding my wealth, afraid it would change how people treated me. We were two women pretending to be something smaller than we were, each guarding a secret that isolated us from others. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into shadow. It struck me with a quiet ache that perhaps we weren't so different after all. We both hid from truth, but for opposite reasons. That realization lingered with me for days afterward, sitting somewhere deep in my chest like an unfinished sentence. I told myself I wouldn't let it bother me, that I was too old to get tangled in the small dramas of youth. But the truth has a way of echoing, even when you try not to listen. Amanda's polished world, her avoidance of who she once was, it stirred something in me. I began to see how fragile peace can be when pride enters the room. It was Daniel's idea to have dinner together again that weekend. He said he wanted a family night, his voice soft and coaxing over the phone, as if he sensed the tension that hung between us. I agreed, of course. There was no point in refusing. Families survive on small acts of politeness, even when affection runs thin. I spent the day preparing. The roast went in early, the vegetables simmered slowly on the stove. I set the table the way I always had: linen napkins, silver cutlery, my good china. The china mattered to me. It had been a wedding gift, one of the few things William and I kept through every move, every house, every phase of our lives. He used to say a well-laid table was a sign of respect for whoever sat at it. I believed that then. I still do. When Daniel and Amanda arrived, the air seemed to shift. Amanda filled the doorway first, her perfume reaching the room before her voice did. "Oh, this looks lovely," she said, surveying the table. "It's so classic." "Dinner's almost ready," I said, forcing a smile. Daniel kissed my cheek and set down a bottle of wine. "Thought we could celebrate the weekend," he said. We sat together as the food was served, and for a brief moment, things felt normal. Amanda asked about the recipe, Daniel complimented the roast, and I almost believed we were simply three people enjoying a quiet evening. But comfort, in my experience, rarely lasts. As I passed Amanda the bread basket, she noticed my checkbook sitting near the edge of the counter. I'd written a payment earlier for the gardener and forgotten to put it away. "Mom," she said with a little laugh, "you still write checks? That's so old-fashioned." I paused, the knife in my hand, hovering above the plate. Daniel looked up quickly, sensing something, but saying nothing. "Old habits build old fortunes," I replied lightly, slicing into the roast. Amanda laughed, a crisp, polite laugh, as if I'd made a quaint joke. "Well, I guess it worked for you," she said. "Though nowadays everything's online. You should really let me show you some apps. They'd make your life so much easier." "I'm sure they would," I said. "But some things are better kept in handwriting. It's harder to erase. Daniel chuckled nervously. Mom's a traditionalist, he said, trying to steer the moment into safer waters. Amanda smiled, lifting her glass. Nothing wrong with that, she said, though her tone carried that familiar edge of indulgence the way people speak when they're convinced they're being gracious. Dinner went on, but something in me had gone quiet. I let their conversation drift around me, nodding, occasionally answering when needed. I noticed how Amanda spoke in a language of certainty. Her new project, her next promotion, the kind of confidence that only comes when you've never had to lose much. Daniel watched her the way men watch something fragile they don't yet realize is dangerous. When dessert came, I poured tea into my favorite porcelain cups, the ones painted with small blue roses. Amanda took hers absent-mindedly, scrolling through her phone. Daniel complimented the meal again, and I smiled, grateful for the attempt. But as I reached to pass him the sugar bowl, my fingers brushed the edge of the cup. It slipped. Time seemed to slow as it fell, spinning once, twice, before shattering on the floor. The sound was sharp, bright, and final. "Oh no," Amanda exclaimed, half rising from her chair. "I'm so sorry, did I—" "It's fine," I said quickly, already bending down. The pieces were scattered across the tile, small and glittering. I gathered them carefully, my fingers trembling slightly. One fragment caught the light, its painted rose still whole against the jagged edge. I could feel Amanda watching me, her pity mistaken for kindness. "Don't worry about it, Mom," Daniel said gently. "It's just a cup. Just a cup." I nodded and kept picking up the pieces. But it wasn't the porcelain that broke it, was the silence that had held us all together, that fragile, unspoken agreement that I would stay small and unimportant so they could stay comfortable. When I stood, the cup was gone, but its echo remained sharp and cold and lodged somewhere deep inside me. That sound of breaking porcelain echoed in my chest. For a long moment, I just stared at the shards scattered across the tile, the tiny fragments catching the light like slivers of ice. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the sink. Daniel and Amanda were still at the table, frozen, unsure of what to do. My hands trembled slightly as I crouched down. "It's fine," I said again, though my voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Daniel rose halfway from his chair. "Mom, let me—" "I've got it," I said softly. He hesitated, then sat back down. I reached for a larger piece, the one with the blue rose still intact, and as I did, a sharp edge sliced through my skin. I felt it before I saw it, the clean, quick sting of porcelain against flesh. A thin line of red welled up across my palm, spreading into a small drop that fell onto the white tile. For a second, I just watched it bloom there, bright and real. Amanda made a small sound, half gasp, half pity. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice unsure, as though she wasn't certain if she should care or apologize. "It happens," I murmured. I tore a napkin from the table and pressed it against the cut. Daniel looked uncomfortable, his gaze darting between us. "Let me get you a bandage," he said, already moving toward the cabinet. I nodded, keeping pressure on the wound. The tile beneath me felt cold through the thin fabric of my skirt. There was something sobering about being down on the floor, collecting broken things while the rest of the world sat watching. It was a posture I knew too well. Quiet, invisible, necessary. When the floor was clear, I stood slowly. Amanda was scrolling on her phone now, perhaps as a distraction from the silence she'd helped create. The napkin had already turned a pale shade of pink. Daniel handed me a small adhesive bandage, and I thanked him. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Lane Amanda said, finally, her tone polite, almost rehearsed. "There's nothing to be sorry for," I said, and I meant it, though not in the way she thought. After they left that evening, the house returned to its stillness. I locked the door, turned off the porch light, and went back to the kitchen. The counter gleamed, the dishes were stacked neatly in the sink, but the floor still bore faint traces of where the cup had shattered. I knelt again this time, not to clean, but to look. A tiny shard had escaped my earlier sweep, tucked beneath the edge of the cabinet. I picked it up carefully, holding it between my thumb and forefinger. It was smooth on one side, jagged on the other, beautiful in its imperfection. As I stood, I caught sight of my reflection in the dark window above the sink. The faint lamplight outlined my face, softer and older than I remembered, but steady. Behind me, the empty table sat like a stage after a performance had ended. I could still hear Amanda's laugh echoing faintly in the room, the sound of it bright and hollow. Somewhere far away in the city, I imagined her pouring herself a glass of wine, sliding onto her couch, her face glowing blue from the light of her phone. I could see her posture legs crossed, chin tilted just so, as she snapped a photo of the glass in her hand. She'd picked the right filter, something warm and golden, and typed the caption with care. Winning. I could almost see it appear on her screen, perfect and detached from anything real. A performance like most of what she did. I turned my hand over, examining the cut. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to sting. I rinsed it under cool water, watching the pink ribbon swirl down the drain. The pain was sharp, but there was clarity in it. Pain tells you you're still alive, still capable of feeling. It humbles you, but it also reminds you that not everything broken is lost. I wrapped my hand in a small strip of gauze, then returned to the table. The other cups sat neatly in their places, untouched. I lifted one, poured the last of the tea into it, and sat down. The warmth spread through my palms as I held it, steadying me. "You broke it," I whispered to the empty room, but not me. The words surprised me with their certainty. They weren't meant for Amanda, not entirely. They were meant for every moment I had swallowed my pride, every silence I had endured for the sake of keeping peace. I thought of William then, of the early years when everything we had built was fragile and uncertain. He used to say that real strength doesn't come from standing tall, it comes from knowing how to bend and not break. I wondered what he'd say if he saw me now, holding on to the pieces of a life that looked whole from the outside but felt like something else entirely on the inside. I finished the tea, the last sip cool against my tongue. The night outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums with unspoken thoughts. I stood, washed the cup carefully, and placed it back in the cabinet. My hand throbbed faintly beneath the bandage, but the ache felt almost cleansing, a reminder that healing always starts with a wound. I turned off the light and paused at the kitchen door. The air smelled faintly of tea and soap. Somewhere in the house, the clock chimed softly, each note steady and sure. It was time to stop cleaning up after other people's messes. I woke the next morning with that thought still echoing in my mind. The house felt different, lighter somehow, as if something inside me had quietly shifted overnight. I moved through my morning routine without hurry. The kettle whistled. The toast. Browned the world went on as it always had. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm of things, I sensed the faint hum of change, a pulse I hadn't felt in years. By late morning, I decided to drive into town for groceries. I hadn't planned on seeing anyone, least of all someone from my old life. It had been so long since that world had touched mine that I'd almost convinced myself it never really existed. The grocery store was quiet for a Saturday, the aisles half empty. I walked slowly, enjoying the anonymity of it. The hum of the refrigerators, the small squeak of the cartwheel that wobbled with every turn. I was standing in front of the produce display, turning an apple in my hand when I heard a voice behind me, deep, warm, faintly familiar. Margaret Lane. I'd know that posture anywhere. I turned startled, and there he was. Charles Bennett. Older, a little grayer, but unmistakable. He had been William's partner for years, back when Fairmont Corporation was just a seedling of an idea we watered with ambition and sleepless nights. I hadn't seen him in nearly a decade. Charles Versarce said, and I could hear the surprise in my own voice. It's been a long time. He smiled broadly. Too long. You disappeared after William passed. Everyone thought you'd moved away. I shook my head. No, just quieter. He chuckled. You quiet. I remember board meetings where you were the only one brave enough to tell the truth. I smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Age softens the edges. Not you, he said kindly. Still sharp as ever, you were Mrs. Lane from Fairmont Corp. Weren't you? Still am, I said, meeting his gaze. Something flickered in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition that I was still very much myself. He nodded thoughtfully. I always admired the way you handled things. You know I ran into someone from your family recently. Oh, I asked, pretending not to know where this might go. Your daughter-in-law, I believe. Amanda Lane. She's consulting with one of our firms now, very ambitious. Talks a lot about innovation branding, that sort of thing. My lips curved into a small smile before I could stop them. Does she now? She's impressive, he said, though his tone softened slightly, suggesting caution. A little eager to make her mark. But smart. She is, I agreed. Very modern, he laughed. Yes, that's the word for it. Modern. Then after a pause, she reminds me of you, in a way. That same determination. I tilted my head. Perhaps, though determination and wisdom are often confused when you're young. He smiled again. Fair point. Well, it's good to see you, Margaret. You look content. I am, I said. Or at least I'm learning to be. When we parted, he placed a hand on my shoulder. You were always one of the best minds I worked with. Don't let the world forget that. I don't plan to, I said, and watched him walk away. I stood there for a long moment, surrounded by apples and oranges, feeling something awaken in me that had been dormant for years. It wasn't pride exactly, more like recognition. A sudden remembering of who I had been before the quiet, before the garden and the teacups, and the smallness I'd wrapped around myself. For so long, I'd told myself that peace was the goal. But peace had become another kind of hiding. I finished shopping without really noticing what I put in the cart. The hum of the store faded behind me as I stepped into the sunlight. The air was crisp, and for the first time in years, I felt alive in it, not as a widow or a mother or a bystander, but as the woman who had once built an empire from nothing. When I got home, I carried the groceries into the kitchen, set them on the counter, and stood there in the stillness. My hand brushed against the drawer where I kept my old business files, contracts, records, things I hadn't touched in years. I opened it. The papers were yellowed at the edges, but the numbers still spoke the same language. Profits, investments, dividends. My signature stared back at me from the past. Strong, certain. I sat down at the table, took a deep breath, and reached for my phone. The number came to me easily, muscle memory from a life I thought I'd left behind. When the familiar voice answered, my tone was calm, steady, precise. Good afternoon, Richard, I said. It's Margaret Lane. There was a pause, then a surprised laugh. Mrs. Lane. It's been years. What can I do for you? I need you to send me my portfolio, I said. All of it. Of course, he said. Are you making changes? Not yet, I replied. Just reviewing. When I hung up, I felt no rush of anger, no thirst for revenge. What I felt was clarity, sharp and clean, like light through glass. The world had mistaken my silence for absence. Amanda had mistaken my restraint for weakness. They had all forgotten who I was. I looked out the window at the roses swaying in the afternoon breeze. Their petals caught the light, soft yet stubborn, surviving every season. I smiled to myself. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. And when you wake up after years of pretending to sleep, the world looks different, sharper, simpler. You stop seeing people as they say they are, and you start seeing them as they act. That morning, I sat at my kitchen table with the curtains drawn halfway, papers spread out before me like a map of the life I'd kept hidden. The sound of pen against paper, the soft rustle of contracts and bank statements, it was all strangely comforting. These weren't just numbers and signatures. They were proof of every sacrifice, every choice William and I had made together. I'd opened the old safe the night before, the one behind the bookshelf that no one but William and I ever knew about. Inside had been the records of our holdings, real estate deeds company shares, certificates of stock. I hadn't touched them in years, but they'd been growing quietly, like the roots of the roses outside. Decades of patience, investment, and silence enough to make anyone's assumptions dangerous. I was reviewing a real estate portfolio when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't look up right away. The rhythm of the steps was familiar, steady, careful. My son. Mom. Daniel's voice carried a mix of surprise and confusion. What is all this? I looked up slowly. He stood in the doorway, his jacket slung over one arm, his brow furrowed. The morning light hit his face, and for a second, I saw the boy. He'd been the boy who used to follow his father around the office, asking questions about balance sheets and partnerships. Everything your father and I built, I said quietly, before betrayal. He stepped closer, scanning the documents. Fairmont Corporation, properties in Denver, Seattle. Is this all yours? Ours, I corrected. Your father's and mine. It was supposed to be the family's. He sat down slowly, still staring at the numbers. I thought you sold everything after Dad died. I sold enough to make people stop asking questions, I said, and kept what mattered, quietly. There are advantages to being underestimated. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were young, I said, and because I wanted you to learn to build your own life before inheriting mine. He rubbed his temples. Amanda! She has no idea, does she? I smiled faintly. No. And I imagine she wouldn't have called me old-fashioned if she did. For a long time, Daniel said nothing. The silence between us was thick, but not hostile, just full of things that had gone unsaid for years. Finally, he spoke. You know that night at dinner, when she said those things to you? I should have said something. I looked at him steadily. Yes, I said softly. You should have. His eyes dropped to the table. I was embarrassed, Mom. I'm sorry. She has this way of making me feel like I have to keep the peace. I know I said. She confuses control with composure. You learned it from me, I suppose. I kept peace for far too long. He gave a small, humorless laugh. You're not angry with me? No, I said. Anger's a waste of time. I'm simply done letting people mistake my kindness for weakness. He looked at me, then really looked at me as if seeing a stranger he recognized. You're planning something, he said quietly. Not planning, I replied. Preparing. There's a difference. He hesitated, then reached for one of the papers. These shares, they're in Amanda's firm's parent company. I know, I said. I noticed that too. He stared at me, realization dawning in his eyes. You could control it. I already do, I said. I just haven't reminded anyone yet. For a moment, he sat there in stunned silence. Then in a voice almost too soft to hear, he said, Mom, I should have defended you. I met his gaze and held it. Then do it tomorrow. He blinked, unsure. Tomorrow? Yes, I said, folding the papers neatly back into a file. Tomorrow when we all sit together again. When she brings her opinions, her pride, her definitions of what wealth looks like. That's when you'll stand where you should have stood all along. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. There was no fear in him, only resolve. He straightened his shoulders the way his father used to when he'd made a final decision. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to tell the truth, I said simply. Not the version people imagine. The real one. He smiled faintly, almost nervously. She won't see it coming. No, I said, rising from my chair, and that's the point. The ones who think they're smartest never do. We stood there a moment longer, the sunlight falling across the table, illuminating the papers like some quiet revelation. For the first time in years, Daniel looked like his father, not in appearance, but in the steadiness of his expression. He reached across the table, resting his hand on mine. I'll be there, he said. I know, I replied. It's time you saw who your mother really is. When he left, I gathered the documents back into their folder and slipped them into my bag. The house was silent again, but it was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the stillness before a storm, a calm I understood well. I stood by the window, watching the wind stir the garden, the roses bending but unbroken. Tomorrow the truth would sit at my table. That thought followed me into the morning light like a quiet promise. I woke early, not from nerves but from certainty. The kind of certainty that comes when you finally stop apologizing for your own strength. The sky outside was washed in pale gold, and for once, the house didn't feel heavy. It felt poised, ready. I brewed a pot of tea, laid out the good china, and polished the silver tray William and I had bought in London decades ago. He used to say that good manners were the armor of the wise. I smiled as I remembered that. By the time Daniel arrived, I had already arranged everything. The tea set gleamed under the kitchen light, and beside it sat the old leather ledger I'd taken from the safe. Daniel paused in the doorway, his eyes flicking to the book. You're really doing this? He asked quietly. Yes, I said, calmly. He nodded, his expression solemn. I'll be here. When Amanda arrived, she was radiant as always, dressed to impress her smile, bright and practiced. Oh, this looks lovely, she said as she stepped inside. So formal. Are we celebrating something? Just family, I replied, pouring her tea. She sat down across from me, her posture perfect, her tone breezy. Well, I'm glad. I've had the most exhausting week. Clients' deadlines, new deals, you know how it is. I remember, I said evenly. It's been a while since I worked in that world. Amanda gave a sympathetic smile. It's changed so much since then. Everything's faster, more competitive. You really have to be on top of your game to stay relevant. Daniel shifted in his seat. I watched her closely, the way she talked about herself, as though the room needed convincing. I lifted the teapot, poured 3 cups, and handed her one. Tell me something, Amanda, I said gently. What makes you rich? She blinked, caught off guard by the question. Then she laughed lightly. What makes me rich? Oh, I don't know, hard work, I guess. I waited. She smiled, taking it as encouragement. I mean, my job pays well. I manage campaigns for luxury brands now. My car's a Tesla custom interior. And our condo downtown, it's worth a fortune already. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he stayed quiet. I nodded, setting down my cup. So your job, your car, your condo, that's what makes you rich. Well, yes, she said, still smiling. What else would it be? I reached for the ledger, the old leather creaking softly as I opened it. The smell of aged paper filled the air, familiar grounding. I turned a few pages, then stopped sliding it toward her. That dealership you're so proud of driving through, I said. I own it. Amanda blinked, confused. What? And that condo building downtown, I continued. Mine as well. Your unit, in fact, sits under the trust name Lane Holdings. Daniel watched silently as her smile faltered. I know that's not possible, she stammered. You can't. Oh, but I can, I said softly. I bought the block years ago before it became trendy. It was a failing development then. She stared down at the pages as though the numbers might rearrange themselves into something she could understand. You tricked me, she said finally, her voice trembling. You made me look stupid. No, dear, I said, my tone calm. You chose the stage. I simply turned on the light. She pushed back from the table, her face flushed. You made me a fool, she shouted, her voice cracking. Daniel slammed his hand on the table so hard the cups rattled. You did that when you disrespected my mother. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Amanda froze, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. Her eyes welled with tears, her bravado melting away. I didn't mean she began, but her voice broke, and she pressed her hands to her face. I didn't know. I watched her shoulders shake, the sound of her sobbing raw and real. I felt no pleasure in it, only the weight of truth settling where pretense used to be. Now you see, I said quietly. Real wealth whispers. She lifted her head. Her mascara smudged, her pride finally cracked. I'm sorry, Mrs. Lane, she said through her tears. I was wrong. I judged you. I didn't know who you were. It's not about who I am, I said. It's about who you chose to be. Daniel reached for my hand, his grip steady, protective. Amanda's sobs softened into quiet sniffles. I looked at her and saw not an enemy, but a woman trapped by her own illusions, the version of herself she'd spent years performing for the world. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock and the soft drip of tea from a cup that had tipped slightly in the commotion. It formed a small puddle on the white tablecloth, a stain that would never quite wash out. I leaned back, feeling the strange stillness of victory, not loud, not cruel, just complete. Amanda stared down at the ledger as if it were a mirror reflecting everything she'd refused to see. Daniel's hand remained over mine, his silence saying everything words couldn't. But the lesson wasn't over. The house was still and heavy after they left that night, the air thick with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. I stayed seated at the table, long after the door closed behind them. The teacups were cold, the ledger still open in front of me, its numbers neat and steady, while the world around them had cracked. I thought of Amanda's face, that brief flash of confusion, giving way to anger, then to tears. She'd looked so small in that moment, so lost inside the armor she'd built. I didn't pity her, not exactly. I just understood her too well. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. His voice was tired when I answered. She's furious, Mom, he said. I figured I replied. How bad is it? He sighed. She thinks you humiliated her on purpose. She said, and I quote, "Your mother made me look like an idiot." She humiliated herself, I said softly. I told her that he said, and there was a note of quiet strength in his voice that hadn't been there before. I told her you only told the truth. That made me smile, though I kept my tone even. Truth has a way of stripping off costumes, I said. Not everyone's ready to stand without one. He was silent for a moment. She's not handling it well. She said she's quitting her job, something about starting her own firm. She thinks she can rebuild her image, prove she doesn't need anyone. Pride is a poor business partner, I said, but she'll learn that in time. I don't want things to get worse, Daniel murmured. They already are, I said gently. But sometimes things have to break before they can mend. After we hung up, I sat for a long while staring out the window. The roses were blooming again, their petals soft and open, as if the world didn't care about human pride. I poured myself another cup of tea, the simple act, grounding me in a way that numbers and ledgers never could. I wasn't angry, not anymore. The time for anger had passed. What remained was something colder, quieter, and perhaps kinder. Amanda's downfall wasn't my doing. It was her own reflection coming back to meet her. 2 days later, I received a call from my lawyer, Richard. He'd been managing my portfolio since the day I took over after William's passing. "Mrs. Lane," he said cheerfully, "I saw the notice about Fairmont Media's internal shift. One of their senior consultants just resigned, Amanda Lane. Related to you by chance?" I allowed myself a small laugh. "Unfortunately, yes. She's my daughter-in-law." "Well, it looks like she's branching out on her own," he said. "Quite a risk in this market." "Yes," I said, stirring sugar into my tea. "Let's see if pride can pay rent." He chuckled, though I wasn't joking. Within weeks, the rumors began to surface. They reached me not directly, but in fragments: a mutual friend here, a casual mention at the grocery store, an overheard conversation at the community center. Amanda's new venture had launched with the usual fanfare: press photos, social media posts, a glossy website full of promises about vision and modern leadership. But whispers followed. Clients she'd expected to secure declined her proposals. Former colleagues kept their distance. Investors hesitated. I didn't intervene. I didn't have to. I'd lived long enough to know that arrogance creates its own gravity. It pulls you down eventually. Daniel came by one evening, worry etched across his face. He told me she'd been calling everyone she knew, trying to salvage her reputation. "She says people are avoiding her calls," he said. "I think she thought she could outwork what happened." "She's learning," I said simply. "She blames you," he added softly. "Of course she does," I replied. "It's easier to blame someone else than to face a mirror." He sat down across from me, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't think she'll ever forgive me for taking your side." I placed my hand over his. "You didn't take my side," I said. "You took the side of what's right. The rest will follow in time." He looked down. "I just wish she'd stop fighting ghosts." "She's not fighting ghosts," I said. "She's fighting herself." Over the next few months, Amanda's name began to fade from the local business pages. The glossy photos stopped. Her confident posts grew infrequent, then disappeared altogether. Daniel mentioned she was spending more time at home, sleeping late, growing restless. Pride can be loud when it's rising, but when it falls, it goes quiet. One afternoon, I ran into an old acquaintance at the bank, a woman I hadn't seen in years. She mentioned she'd been approached by Amanda for consulting work. "Lovely girl," she said delicately, "but a bit defensive. I think she's trying to prove something." I smiled politely. "Aren't we all?" That night I sat alone at my kitchen table again. The ledger was gone now, tucked back into the safe where it belonged. I no longer needed to look at numbers to remember what I was capable of. The house was calm, the kind of calm that comes after a storm has done its worst, and the world is finally still. I poured myself a glass of wine, not tea this time, and thought about Amanda. I imagined her sitting somewhere in her condo, surrounded by the echoes of her own ambition. Maybe she still had the same glass of wine she'd once posed with for her followers. Maybe she was looking at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, wondering when exactly her power had begun to slip away. I didn't feel pity or triumph, just a quiet recognition. Life had stepped in where I no longer needed to. It had taken over the teaching, the humbling, the reshaping. That's how it always works. Time is the only mentor that never runs out of lessons. The wind outside rustled the curtains, carrying the faint scent of rain. I thought of William again, how he used to say that truth doesn't shout, it whispers, and those who ignore it end up chasing its echo. Amanda had spent years running from hers. Now it had caught up. I sipped my wine slowly, letting the stillness settle around me. Somewhere beyond the walls of my home, Amanda was beginning her own education, one the world would make sure she finished. Life started teaching her what I no longer had to. Seasons passed quietly after that. My days found their rhythm again, morning walks through the garden, afternoons spent reading by the window, the evenings softened by the slow hum of a familiar piece. Daniel came by, often bringing groceries or simply sitting for a while. He seemed lighter now, though I could see the unspoken tension in his eyes whenever Amanda's name came up. He loved her still, I think. But that love had worn thin in places where pride had rubbed it raw. He didn't ask me to forgive her. He knew I already had in the only way I could, by stepping aside and letting truth do its work. It had been almost 3 months since I last saw her when I heard the knock at my door. It was a steady, deliberate knock, not Daniel's usual impatient rhythm. I set my book aside and went to answer. When I opened the door, there she was. Amanda stood on the porch, dressed simply, her hair pulled back, no visible makeup. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. Her posture had changed, still straight, still proud but smaller somehow. Her smile was polite, uncertain. "Hello, Mrs. Lane," she said softly. "Amanda," I replied. "This is a surprise." "I hope it's not a bad one," she said, forcing a light laugh. "May I come in?" I hesitated only a second before stepping aside. "Of course." She followed me into the kitchen, her eyes flicking briefly over the same space that had once hosted her humiliation. Perhaps she remembered the ledger, the tea, the truth laid bare. I poured her a cup without asking. It felt right. Courtesy costs nothing, even when it's undeserved. We sat at the table, the same one where everything had changed. She held the cup carefully, both hands around it, as if seeking warmth. I wanted to come by. She began to make peace. Her tone was soft, measured, almost too careful. I gave a small nod. "Peace is always welcome," I said. She smiled, her lips trembling slightly. "I've had a rough few months," she admitted. "Business has been slow. Starting over is harder than I thought." "I can imagine," I said gently. "I'm not here to complain," she added quickly. "I just wanted you to know that I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about you." She paused, searching my face for something, sympathy perhaps. "You were right about a lot of things. I was arrogant. I judged too quickly." I waited, giving her space to continue. The silence stretched between us like an open page. Then slowly her tone shifted. "But I've learned from it," she said. "I'm not the same person I was. I'm building something new now, a consulting firm, small but growing. I've got some promising leads, and I think it could really take off with the right backing." Her eyes lifted to mine, steady, rehearsed. "That's actually part of why I wanted to see you." I took a sip of tea before answering. Go on. I know you've had experience in business, she said. And I thought maybe you'd consider being part of it, an investor or even an advisor. I respect your judgment, Mrs. Lane. I really do. There it was. The real reason she'd come. For a long moment I said nothing. I simply watched her. Her eager hands, her careful words, the way she leaned forward just enough to seem sincere. She wasn't lying, not exactly. She wanted peace, yes, but on her own terms. Her apology was just another form of negotiation. Finally, I set my cup down and folded my hands on the table. Amanda, I said quietly, what you're building sounds ambitious. I'm sure it will take a great deal of effort and humility. She nodded quickly. Exactly. And I'm ready for that. I'm glad to hear it, I said. But as for investing, I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. I invest in people, not apologies. Her smile faltered, the shine in her eyes dimming just a little. This isn't just about money, she said, her tone tightening. It's about moving forward. It always is, I replied evenly. She looked away, then her fingers tightening around the cup. I'm not asking for a handout, she said softly. Just a chance to prove I've changed. Then prove it, I said. To yourself. Her eyes flicked back to mine, searching for weakness, for warmth, for anything she could turn into an opening. There was none. I see, she said finally, setting down her cup with deliberate care. Her smile returned, thin and forced. Well, I suppose I misread things. You read them correctly, I said gently. You just hoped the story had a different ending. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked in the background, marking each second like a heartbeat. She rose first, smoothing her blouse, gathering what was left of her pride. I appreciate your time, she said. And I appreciate your visit, I replied. She hesitated near the door, glancing back once more. You really don't believe I've changed, do you? I believe you're trying, I said. But I also believe you still think change can be bought. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She simply nodded once and left the sound of her heels fading down the walkway. I stood by the window and watched her go, the afternoon light catching on her car as she drove away. For a long while, I stayed there, the quiet of the house wrapping around me again. The tea on the table had gone cold, but I didn't mind. The scene had felt inevitable from the start, like an old melody returning to its chorus. Amanda wanted peace, yes, but she wanted it to look the way she'd imagined it, elegant, profitable, controlled. She wanted the world to see her as redeemed, not to do the work of becoming so. I thought of William again, of his favorite saying. Some people chase money because they think it changes everything. Others build value so quietly they forget to count it. I smiled faintly at that. He would have seen through her too. I picked up her untouched cup and carried it to the sink. The residue of her lipstick clung faintly to the rim, pale against the porcelain. I rinsed it away and watched the water swirl down the drain. As the last of the sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor, I felt that familiar calm settle over me again. Amanda might have come looking for reconciliation, but she left with something else, reality. It's a teacher far less gentle than I ever was. She still thought money was the cure. That night, as I sat alone by the window with my tea cooling beside me, I realized that Amanda's visit had only confirmed what I already knew. She hadn't come seeking forgiveness, only validation. It wasn't reconciliation she wanted. It was restoration of her pride. And pride, once cracked, rarely repairs the same way again. I told myself I'd done all I could. The rest, as ever, would be up to time. Weeks passed, and life resumed its steady rhythm. The days grew longer. The garden shifted into late bloom. Daniel visited often, helping me trim the hedges, sharing quiet dinners that needed no conversation to fill them. He told me little about Amanda now, and I didn't ask. But sometimes, as he spoke, I caught a faint sadness in his tone, a recognition that the woman he'd once loved had chosen her image over her heart. It was on a Tuesday morning, clear and cool, when Richard called from the foundation office. "Mrs. Lane," he said, "I thought you'd like to know. There's an interesting name on the applicant list for the Fairmont Integrity Initiative." I smiled at the name even before he said it. Amanda Lane, precisely. She's applied for a communications role, a senior one no less. "Does she know who owns the company?" I asked. "I doubt it," he said, amused. "The Lane Foundation's stake isn't public. Shall I handle it?" "No," I said after a pause. "I'll attend the interviews myself." Quietly. When the day came, I dressed simply, a navy suit, pearl earrings, the kind of quiet formality that had once been my armor. The building was bright and modern glass walls gleaming under the late morning sun. I'd helped design its mission years ago, a program to fund community development, business ethics, and sustainable growth. It was the kind of work I'd once dreamed Amanda might have been proud of. The conference room was cool and professional, a long mahogany table stretched before a panel of 3 interviewers. At the far end, I took my seat. The HR officer, a young woman named Melissa, introduced the candidates one by one. When Amanda entered, I saw her hesitate for just a moment. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but she composed herself quickly, offering a poised smile. "Mrs. Lane," she said, her tone light. "I didn't realize you were part of the board." "Just an observer today," I replied evenly. She nodded and turned to the panel, her confidence visibly returning. Her hair was perfectly set, her clothes understated but expensive. She carried a sleek leather folder and the air of someone trying very hard not to look desperate. The interview began smoothly enough. She spoke well, she always had. Her voice had that polished cadence that had served her well in marketing. "My background," she said confidently, "is in luxury branding. I specialize in selling aspiration, connecting people with products that elevate their lives." Melissa took notes. Another panelist, a senior director named Howard, leaned forward. "And how do you see that translating into this role?" Amanda smiled, ready for the question. "Integrity is a kind of luxury too," she said. "It's about perception, about building trust through presentation. Image is power." I watched her carefully, every word confirming that she still hadn't learned. Her vocabulary had changed, but her values had not. When the others finished their questions, Melissa turned to me. "Mrs. Lane, would you like to add anything?" For a moment, I simply looked at Amanda. The silence stretched long enough for her to shift slightly in her chair. Then I spoke, my voice calm and measured. "You said you specialize in selling luxury," I began. Amanda nodded, relieved that the question sounded benign. "Yes, that's right." I tilted my head. "We don't sell luxury here," I said quietly. "We build integrity." Her expression froze, the faintest flicker of panic darting behind her eyes. The room went still. Melissa glanced between us, uncertain, but Howard understood immediately. He closed the folder before him, his pen set down with finality. Amanda's voice faltered. "I didn't mean it that way." "What I meant was—" Melissa cleared her throat gently. "Thank you, Ms. Lane. That will be all." She drew a neat line through Amanda's name on her list. Amanda sat back, the color draining from her face. She looked at me across the table, disbelief and humiliation mixing in her eyes. "You did this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "No, dear," I said softly. "You did it to yourself again." The room remained silent. Amanda stood slowly, her composure unraveling with each breath. She gathered her folder, her hands trembling just enough to betray her. For a moment she looked as if she might say something more, an insult perhaps, or a plea, but then thought better of it. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. As it closed behind her, Melissa looked down at her notes and exhaled. "That was unexpected," she murmured. Howard glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. "Integrity, indeed," he said quietly. When the meeting ended, I remained seated for a moment, the stillness of the room wrapping around me. I didn't feel triumphant or vindictive, only settled. There's a difference between revenge and justice. One screams, the other breathes. I had waited long enough for the truth to balance itself. Outside, the sunlight glinted off the glass walls, casting faint reflections across the marble floor. I walked through the lobby slowly, my heels clicking against the tile. As I stepped out into the warm afternoon, I felt an odd peace. The past had finally folded itself neatly into the present. On my way home, I thought of Amanda not with anger, but with something like pity. She would tell herself this was unfair, that I'd orchestrated her failure. But fairness had nothing to do with it. The world, sooner or later, simply reflects who we are. She'd built her life on image, and images by nature fade. When I reached home, I poured myself a cup of tea, the same ritual that had anchored me through every storm. I sat by the window, the garden glowing gold in the late light, and thought about the long, winding road that had led us all here. Justice doesn't shout. It settles quietly. Those words lingered in me long after the day at Fairmont, as though they had taken root somewhere deep in my chest. The days that followed were calm again, filled with the kind of peace that comes when you no longer have anything left to prove. My work at the Lane Foundation occupied most of my mornings, and in the afternoons I walked through the rose garden William and I had planted so many years ago. The world had returned to balance, or so I thought. It was late on a Thursday when she came in. I was in my office reviewing the monthly reports on grant allocations when our front desk manager, Claire, appeared at the door. "Mrs. Lane," she said softly, "there's a woman here asking for assistance. She doesn't have an appointment, but I think you'll want to meet her." Something in her tone made me look up. "Send her in," I said. A moment later, the door opened, and a small, thin woman stepped inside. Her clothes were worn but clean, her posture uncertain yet proud. Her hands twisted around a folded application form. I recognized her before she even spoke. The shape of her face, the slope of her nose. It was Amanda's face, aged by hardship and humility. "Mrs. Lane," she said, her voice rough from years of disuse, I don't want to waste your time. My name's Evelyn. I was told your foundation helps with housing and medical aid." "Yes," I said quietly, forcing my heartbeat to steady. "Please sit down." She hesitated before lowering herself into the chair opposite me. "My health isn't what it used to be," she continued, "and my landlord's selling the building. I've tried applying elsewhere, but, well, it's hard when you're old and alone." Her eyes lifted to mine for just a moment, and in them I saw something Amanda had always hidden: vulnerability without performance. She had none of her daughter's polish, none of her charm, only honesty. I reached for the papers in her trembling hands and began reading. Her application was simple, a request for modest assistance, just enough to cover rent and medication for 6 months. I could have approved it with one signature. But my pen hovered over the line, and for the first time in years I felt truly shaken. Evelyn Lane. I remembered Amanda's face at the cafe months earlier, her cold dismissal of a woman who had tried to greet her. I hadn't known then who the woman was, but I saw now the full shape of their story. Poverty wasn't something Amanda had escaped. It was something she had buried. Before I could speak, there was a commotion outside the office, a door opening too fast, hurried footsteps, and then Amanda appeared in the doorway, breathless. Her hair was loose, her face pale. "Mother," she gasped. Then, seeing me, she froze. "Mrs. Lane!" Evelyn turned, startled. Amanda. Her voice trembled, filled with disbelief. Amanda crossed the room quickly, kneeling beside her mother's chair. "You shouldn't have come here alone," she said, her voice breaking. "I told you I'd handle it. I didn't want to bother you," Evelyn murmured. "You've got enough on your plate." I said I'd help, Amanda insisted, but there was no anger now, only fear and shame. I watched them silently, the two women who had once been divided by pride and poverty, now facing each other with nothing left to hide behind. Amanda turned to me, eyes glistening. "Please," she said. "Please help her. She's my mother." Her voice cracked on the last word. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't strategy. It was raw, unguarded humanity. For the first time, she wasn't trying to win. She was simply asking. I looked down at the papers again. The numbers were small, the need real. I signed the form with a steady hand and slid it across the desk toward Claire, who had quietly appeared in the doorway. "Approve the full amount," I said, "and add a living stipend for 1 year. No conditions." Amanda blinked, stunned. You'll do that?" "Yes," I said softly. "No conditions, just dignity." For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Amanda turned toward her mother, gripping her hand tightly. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she reached up to wipe them away. It was the kind of moment that strips the world down to its simplest truth. Love and shame, forgiveness and need all tangled together. Amanda looked up at me, her voice shaking. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," I said. "This isn't about gratitude." She lowered her head. "I was so cruel," she whispered. "To you, to her, to everyone." I felt the faintest ache in my chest, not pity, not satisfaction, something gentler. "Cruelty often comes from fear," I said. "Fear of not being enough. Fear of being seen." Amanda nodded slowly, tears still falling. "I thought if I pretended long enough, I could outrun where I came from." "No one outruns their roots," I said. "They just learn how to grow from them." For a long time, the only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of the clock. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice breaking the silence. "Thank you, Mrs. Lane. You've done more than you know." I smiled faintly. "Take care of each other," I said. They left together, Amanda's arm steadying her mother's as they walked out into the afternoon light. I watched from the window as they crossed the courtyard, their figures framed by the sunlight like an echo of something long overdue. When the door closed and the office was quiet again, I sat back in my chair, my pen still in hand. The room felt different somehow, lighter, as if the air itself had forgiven something. I thought of William then, of the long years we'd spent building a life from the ground up, believing that strength came from control. But now, watching Amanda and her mother disappear into the light, I realized I'd been wrong. Strength wasn't control. It was compassion without expectation. I glanced down at the empty page beside the signed form and smiled. My signature had been ink, but the real mark was something deeper, a shift I hadn't expected even from myself. Forgiveness. I realized isn't mercy, it's mastery. Those words lingered with me through the following days, the way the scent of tea clings to a room long after the kettle's gone quiet. For years, my life had been shaped by control, by the need to manage, to correct, to endure. But after that moment with Amanda and her mother, something in me shifted. I didn't feel the thrill of victory or even the lightness of forgiveness. What I felt was deeper, something quieter, something like release. The Lane Foundation continued its work as it always had, but I began to see the faces behind the files differently. Every applicant, every plea, every thank you note, they weren't names in a ledger anymore. They were lives, beating with stories of their own mistakes, losses, and small salvations. When you've lived long enough, you learn that most people aren't cruel out of malice, but out of fear. Amanda had been no different. Daniel came by more often now. Sometimes he'd stay for dinner. Sometimes he'd just sit beside me in the garden, silent and still. We didn't talk much about Amanda, though I could tell she had begun to reach out to him again. I saw the relief in his eyes when he spoke of her, the way his shoulders loosened, when he said, "She's spending more time with her mother. It's good for her." I only nodded. The truth was, I didn't want to know the details. It was enough to know that something broken had begun to heal. It was a Sunday afternoon in late spring when I heard the knock on the door. I was in the kitchen arranging fresh-cut roses in a vase, the air heavy with their sweetness. I knew that knock before I even turned. It was soft, uncertain, hesitant, but not fearful. When I opened the door, Amanda stood there holding a tray. Steam curled gently from the teapot, and for a brief second, I almost smiled at the symmetry of it all. "Hello, Mrs. Lane," she said quietly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You're not," I replied. "Come in." She stepped inside, her eyes taking in the familiar space. She looked different now, simpler, softer. Her clothes were plain, her face unpainted. There was still pride in her posture, but it no longer felt sharp. It had settled into something humbler, more human. "I brought tea," she said, lifting the tray slightly, as if to prove her purpose. "I made it the way you like, black with honey instead of sugar." "That's kind of you," I said. "You remembered." She smiled faintly. "I've been trying to remember a lot of things lately." We sat at the same table where so much had unfolded. The laughter, the humiliation, the silence, the revelations. She poured carefully, her hands steady. When she passed me the cup, I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers, the tiny proof of nerves she hadn't learned to hide. I took a sip. The tea was perfect. Warm, gentle, patient. "This one didn't break," I said softly. She looked at me startled, and then she understood. Her eyes glistened, and she smiled. Small, fragile, but real. "No," she whispered. It didn't. For a moment, we just sat there, two women, linked by a history neither of us would have chosen, but both of us had needed. The air between us was different this time, not heavy, not charged, just quiet. "I owe you more than I can ever say," she said after a while. "Not just for helping my mother. For everything. For showing me what I didn't want to see." I stirred my tea slowly. "You don't owe me," I said. "You owed yourself the truth. You paid that debt when you faced it." "I don't know if I deserve your kindness," she said. "Deserve has nothing to do with it," I replied. "Kindness is a choice, not a transaction." She looked down at her cup, nodding. "I've been volunteering," she said softly, "at the shelter downtown. It's different from what I used to do. There's no applause, no glamour, just work. Real people. I like it." I smiled. "That's a good sign. I think I needed to see what struggle really looks like," she continued. "Not just talk about it in a pitch meeting. My mother, she's doing better. She said you've been checking on her." "Occasionally," I said. "Old habits die hard." Amanda exhaled, her shoulders lowering. I thought if I came here today it would feel awkward, but it doesn't. It feels—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Peaceful. Peace has a way of sneaking in when the noise stops," I said. "But it takes practice to keep it." She smiled again. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," I said, meeting her gaze. "It's just worth it." At that moment, Daniel came through the back door, his hair ruffled by the breeze. He stopped short when he saw us. "Well," he said with a surprised smile, "this is a sight I didn't expect to see." Amanda stood quickly, nervous. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head, walking over to place a hand on her shoulder. "No, I'm glad you did." He looked at me, then his eyes soft. "Mind if I join?" "Always room for one more," I said, and gestured to the kettle. He poured himself a cup and sat down, the three of us together for the first time in what felt like years. For a while there was no need for words. The sunlight poured through the window, falling across the table and catching the faint steam rising from our cups. I could hear the faint hum of bees outside, the low whistle of wind through the rose bushes. It struck me then how strange and beautiful ordinary peace can be, how it hides not in grand gestures, but in the soft, shared silences between people who have finally stopped trying to win. Daniel turned to me. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't think I ever told you how proud I am of how you handled all of this." I smiled at him. "You learned from it too." He laughed softly. "You could say that." Amanda looked at me, her expression earnest. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I do hope we can start over." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "Starting over doesn't mean erasing what came before I said. It means carrying it differently." She blinked back tears. "I'll try. That's all any of us can do," I said. The kettle on the stove whistled softly, and Amanda stood to refill our cups. Her movements were careful, practiced, like someone who finally understood the value of not breaking what's fragile. When she set my cup back down, I could see the steam rising in thin, perfect ribbons, curling into the light. I looked at them both, my son, my daughter-in-law, and for the first time the ache that had lived in my chest for so long began to fade. I realized that peace isn't something you win. It's something you choose, one quiet moment at a time. Amanda sat down again, and Daniel rested a hand gently on my shoulder. The warmth of it spread through me, steady and grounding. "Peace," I said slowly, "isn't about forgiving first. It's about choosing not to fight anymore." Amanda nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I understand now. I know you do," I said. Outside, the garden shimmered in the sunlight. The roses swayed gently, their petals catching the light like silk. The same roses that had stood through every storm, every season, now bloomed brighter than ever. We sat there together, three people bound not by perfection, but by persistence. The tea cooled slowly, the conversation meandered toward laughter, and the air filled with the kind of comfort that only comes when the past finally loosens its hold. For the first time, the house felt full again. And that was my story. A story about pride and peace, about losing your way and finding it again, not through power or wealth, but through understanding. Maybe you've known someone like Amanda, someone who had to fall before they learned how to stand again. Or maybe you've been that person yourself. Life has a way of humbling us all, but if we listen closely, it also gives us second chances. If this story touched you, if you saw a part of your own life in it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have chosen forgiveness or walked away? Your voice matters here. Tell me in the comments what lesson you took from this story. I read every one, and they mean more than you know. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about family forgiveness and the quiet strength that gets us through life's hardest moments, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next one. Every week, I'll share another story, another reflection, another moment that reminds us that life, no matter how complicated, always finds its way back to hope. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for staying until the end. I hope when you leave this story, you carry with you one simple truth. Peace isn't found in winning, it's found in letting go.